So for this theme, we're going to talk about brands and sporting products. This will be our topic for the week. So the brief outline for today will be about the categories of sports products and how branding is important. We'll look at the branding strategies again and look at some real life branding stories in the sports industry and talk about the importance or value of branding from a sports perspective. Just looking at some of the major categories of sports products, and there's certainly some missing here. When we look at sportswear, we often think of brands like Nike and Adidas and Under Armour. You could even include brands like Lululemon in here as well. We're looking at a $350 billion industry per year in the sportswear category, primarily dominated by those major companies, led in North America certainly by Adidas. Sorry, not Adidas. Adidas is more European. So we'll just take a minute and look at some of the major sports product categories, and they're not all listed here. Certainly missing from here would be sports products aligned to ticketing and events and that sort of thing. But certainly the sportswear segment of the sports industry with brand names such as Nike, Adidas, Under Armour, and I would even put Lululemon, for example, in there, Fitbit, those sorts of things represent a $350 billion industry in the US, led primarily by the giants like Nike, for example. Incredibly important. Branding is incredibly important, and consistently Nike is a brand that students in all my marketing classes sort of look to or think about when it comes to their favorite brands. You're looking at gear and equipment, and that could be anything from Bauer and CCM from hockey, Rawlings and Under Armour and Cooper and Peloton, which has certainly been in the news a lot lately, outdoor recreation equipment, including Yeti. I don't even know a lot of brands in the camping or outdoor sporting world, but there's all kinds of very significant and important brands in that sector, including not only product brands, but also retail brands. Places like Source for Sports or Sports Check or Dick's Sporting Goods in the US. Retailers can be part of this as well. And then sports health and sports medicine. So you've got your Gatorades and Powerades, you've got your BioSteel, you've got all the various kinds of sort of sports energy or supplement branding, again, representing really important segments of the sports industry. So branding in sports can happen really among a number of different ways, but three primary ways. There's the marketing of the actual sport or the sporting activities, the sporting events, the sporting associations, the teams, that sort of thing. This is a kind of promotion that's directly related to sports and often is tied to more live events or ticket sales or viewing, sort of media rights and that sort of thing. But there's also marketing through sports, which is different because the marketing through sports doesn't need to be for a product or service that is actually within the sporting industry, but for whatever reason, a brand or a company could feel that there's a significant overlap between their target audience and the audience for a particular sporting event or sports team or sports location, and they look to take advantage of that by piggybacking on the sports itself. So it could be things like having, as it says on the screen, someone like a Connor McDavid endorsing a product that has really nothing to do with sports itself. A great example would be the Sidney Crosby and Nathan McKinnon commercials that they do for Tim Hortons. Tim Hortons would not be considered a company in the sports industry, but they market their products through sports by using recognized superstars in their respective sports to connect with their very Canadian audience. And there's certainly a significant overlap between Tim Hortons customers and hockey fans in Canada. And so that relationship makes a lot of sense. And then there's grassroots marketing, which is used when organizations try to increase participation and awareness of a sport. So this is much less sophisticated, a lot fewer resources or dollars going into these kinds of activities, but this is really very much what you're trying to do for Tennis PEI. You're trying to market this organization, and their fundamental goal is to grow the sport of tennis. So we're not looking at, marketing tickets for a high profile sporting event or that sort of thing. We're looking to, connect with the community in meaningful ways. It's less focused on generating revenue, but it's really about growing the sport itself. And the other stuff may come along. If you grow the sport of tennis, for example, in PEI, you may find it easier, for example, to get local sponsors to support local tournaments or that sort of thing. So there's a variety of different ways you can brand in sports, and it's really important to understand those important distinctions. Some branding strategies that are particularly relevant for sports include, we talked about already, this idea of sponsorship. It's a great way to grow brand awareness to a mass audience, especially if you've got some market research that shows a significant overlap between your target audience and the audience of whatever particular event or team or sport that you intend to sponsor. If you can show that there's a really good overlap, that can be a really, really good fit. It's a great way for sports to generate some revenue and to really find ways to connect with the overall community. This is really important. So think about things like whether you see brands on a sports jersey, or if you ever watch Formula One racing, the cars are completely decked out in their brand sponsorship. We see it if you go to a hockey rink, you'll see the boards around the rink are often, sport advertising. Very, very common because it's very effective. You get your brand recognition out there, and again, really justified if you have good market research to show an overlap in audiences. Which, if you're a sporting organization, is a great reason for you to do market research, because when you're going out looking for sponsorships, you want to be able to show potential sponsors exactly who your customer base is, so that they can make the connection between their own customer base and see that overlap. So that there's another justification for market research. Partnerships are great ways to reach out to customers. Sports teams and brands often align with each other to support their overall objectives. So this is different than sponsorship. This is really a more formal, equal footing partnership where two organizations come together. An example might be, and if you get a chance to talk to some of the Tennis PEI people, is they're partnering and working with some of the other racquetball type sports like pickleball, badminton, and even volleyball, which is not a racket sport, but squash, racquetball. And they work together in a partnership to put together a proposal for a multi-purpose facility that would serve the interests of all of these organizations collectively. So those kinds of partnerships can be really valuable. Of course, you have media rights. It says here television and even sports radio, but this is really about media rights and making sure that whatever media you're choosing or partnering with or working with to get your sports out there are the media that your audiences are listening to or engaging with. So figuring out, what television channels, and for sports, it's somewhat easier, um, in that we have dedicated sports stations, and certain major networks purchase the broadcasting rights to major events like the Super Bowl coming up this weekend, or the Olympics that are on right now. Certain um, uh, networks have the rights to those, but that can be a really impactful branding strategy as well. But outside of the ones that are listed here, you've got social media, for example, could be a really impactful branding strategy. Layering your branding, so you know, having multiple aspects of your brand, and sorry, my last slide got cut off a little bit. Figuring out what your branding strategy is and how you can leverage the equity you've built into your brand is incredibly important. When you're just launching a brand, whether you're the Seattle Kraken or a few years ago the Vegas Golden Knights, cultivating what that brand means and developing a really comprehensive branding strategy is really important. Some branding success stories. Well, Nike's certainly an obvious one. I've said this a couple of times. In my first year marketing class, when I ask students to introduce themselves, I always ask them to identify their favorite brand. And hands down, no question, the most common answer every single semester by a mile is always Nike. Nike has really been able to cultivate a fairly significant fan base. It's the preferred brand of athletic wear, particularly sneakers, but beyond that as well for a lot of people. And they've done that through very, very careful branding strategies that engage, whether it's everything from celebrity endorsers to everyday athletes, challenging people to be the best version of themselves, being relatively inclusive, at least from a branding perspective. I'm not necessarily sure their commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion necessarily translates into their actual corporate practices, but from a branding perspective, they tend to be relatively viewed as relatively inclusive. Adidas is another example, much more popular in Europe. When I was in France about a decade or so ago, I was really struck because, of course, being in North America, it was always Nike, Nike, Nike. When we were in Europe, Adidas was definitely the dominant brand, although I suspect that gap might have closed a little bit over the past decade. But Adidas has a very sort of reputable um, connection to, for example, professional soccer or football, as it would be called. And so that has really served its brand really well, that affiliation with that particular sport, which is one of the most popular sports in the world. Not so much in North America, but certainly elsewhere in the world, football is king. Red Bull is another great example, and they've really embraced sort of non-traditional sports like the X Games and the adrenaline pumping type of extreme sports in some ways. And it really has aligned quite well with what their brand represents and what their brand stands for. And it makes them very, very different than a lot of the other sports brands that tend to focus, at least primarily, on their traditional sports. Um, Red Bull has said, well, we can't compete with, the Gatorades and Powerades and the other giants that really focus on, in North America, the four big sports. And so we're going to create this little niche for ourselves, and they've done an incredibly good job at doing that. Sorry, my last slide got cut off a little bit. Figuring out what your branding strategy is and how you can leverage the equity you've built into your brand is incredibly important. When you're just launching a brand, whether you're the Seattle Kraken or a few years ago the Vegas Golden Knights, cultivating what that brand means and developing a really comprehensive branding strategy is really important. Some branding success stories. Well, Nike's certainly an obvious one. I've said this a couple of times. In my first year marketing class, when I ask students to introduce themselves, I always ask them to identify their favorite brand. And hands down, no question, the most common answer every single semester by a mile is always Nike. Nike has really been able to cultivate a fairly significant fan base. It's the preferred brand of athletic wear, particularly sneakers, but beyond that as well for a lot of people. And they've done that through very, very careful branding strategies that engage, um, whether it's everything from celebrity endorsers to everyday athletes, challenging people to be the best version of themselves, being relatively inclusive, at least from a branding perspective. I'm not necessarily sure their commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion necessarily translates into their actual corporate practices, but from a branding perspective, they tend to be relatively viewed as relatively inclusive. Adidas is another example, much more popular in Europe. When I was in France about a decade or so ago, I was really struck because, of course, being in North America, it was always Nike, Nike, Nike. When we were in Europe, Adidas was definitely the dominant brand, although I suspect that gap might have closed a little bit over the past decade. But Adidas has a very sort of reputable um, connection to, for example, professional soccer or football, as it would be called. And so that has really served its brand really well, that affiliation with that particular sport, which is one of the most popular sports in the world. Not so much in North America, but certainly elsewhere in the world, football is king. Red Bull is another great example, and they've really embraced sort of non-traditional sports like the X Games and the adrenaline pumping type of extreme sports in some ways. And it really has aligned quite well with what their brand represents and what their brand stands for. And it makes them very, very different than a lot of the other sports brands that tend to focus, at least primarily, on their traditional sports. Um, Red Bull has said, well, we can't compete with, the Gatorades and Powerades and the other giants that really focus on, in North America, the four big sports. And so we're going to create this little niche for ourselves, and they've done an incredibly good job at doing that. So why is branding important in sports? Whether you're an athlete or a sports team, a brand helps you to connect with your fans and increase the engagement with your audience. The right brand for sports professionals is a way to show what you stand for within the industry. If you've got a really good brand as as an athlete, it will help you develop those sponsorship deals and those connections with other sources of revenue for you as a professional athlete. It gives fans something concrete to identify with and makes it easier to recognize one brand versus the competition. But if you look at a pair of Nike sneakers, you immediately know they're Nike because the branding is so clear, right? On the surface, your brands may seem like a little more than a logo or a color scheme, but really good branding is much, much more complicated than that and goes way beyond the logo or the color scheme of your particular team, for example. It improves recognition in the community. It helps you connect with those all important community members that you want to engage with. It does make it a lot easier to secure sponsorships because if you can show that your brand really resonates with again, the same target audience that your sponsors or potential sponsors are looking to reach, it makes a very compelling case. It helps establish trust. Branding is really about establishing a level of trust that you know what you're going to get when you engage with this product or service because the brand creates that trust between the consumer and the product. And it can really simplify or streamline your not just your advertising efforts, but all of your marketing efforts if you've got a really strong and recognizable brand presence. So how do you actually figure out if you're starting a new brand, how are you going to create that brand identity? And it does involve a lot of soul searching and figuring out exactly who it is that you want. You almost treat it like a person. Brands have personalities. So what is the personality that you want to embed into your brand? What is it that you're trying to represent? You want to think about your values as an organization or as an athlete. What do you believe in? What do you identify with? And use this to create a persona for your brand and figure out how can you communicate the various elements of that personality to your fans. You want to ensure your brand is very professional and very well developed. You certainly are not going to, you want to invest in professionals to help you develop all those components of your brand. You want your brand messaging to be consistent, right? There isn't a single way your brand is going to express itself. You're going to do it in a variety of different ways and in a variety of different platforms, but there needs to be an underlying consistency. You can't, on the one hand, say that your brand is committed to um, equality, fair play, and inclusion, and then on the other hand, your organization or your practices completely fly in the face of that. So you need to make sure that whatever your brand is going to represent, you represent that consistently. You do want to pay attention to details, and if you ever really studied a brand or even some of the elements of branding, like a logo or some of the other visual or even physical, tangible representations of brands, you'll find that there's a lot of hidden details in there that you as an average consumer might not be aware of, but are really helping to shape your brand. Things like good grammar and punctuation, which should go without saying, because it all sort of ties back into that professional image. And also things like appropriate content. Know who your audience is and make sure your content is appropriate for those audiences, and recognize that if you're putting inappropriate content out there, it may be perceived by your target audience to be okay today, but may actually come back to bite you later on. So putting out questionable, distasteful content that it may appeal to your audience. I'm thinking of the example right now that's in the news a lot is this Joe Rogan person who, uses incredibly racist and sexist and homophobic language fairly regularly. And apparently his audience is okay with that because he's got a huge audience base. But he's starting to get some pushback, and I won't be surprised if sponsors, we're already seeing other musicians pulling their music away from the podcast platform Spotify, and I think we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg here. I think we're going to start to see a bit of a snowball effect, and Spotify so far has stood by him because he's represents a fairly lucrative uh, product on their streaming service. But as the groundswell of people, uh, you know, continue to criticize the content that he has consistently over the years put out, these aren't aberrations or anomalies. This is consistently the kind of content he's put out. If they start losing more partners or sponsors, Spotify is going to have to make some tough decisions about whether or not they want to continue that relationship with him. So it may be okay to your target audience, the kind of content you're putting out there, but the social norms, I guess, are evolving, and what may be considered acceptable to some people today may come back and bite you big time in the future. So you may want to think about those sorts of things.